Good morning children, welcome back. Here I am with the second part of the video of chapter number 8, Confronting Marginalization. In the previous chapter, we have discussed about the struggle of scheduled caste and scheduled tribe to have equality. We have also discussed about Article 17, which says untouchability has been abolished. We have also discussed about Article 15, which says right to equality, irrespective of caste, gender, place of birth, etc. We have also discussed about the rights of minorities. We have also discussed that how government provides seat reservation policy for the SCs, STs and other backward classes for bringing them up. Now we will proceed further and discuss more about the rights of Dalits and Adivasis. So let's start. Children, now let us discuss how the rights of Dalits and Adivasis are protected. In addition to policies, our country also has specific laws that guard against the discrimination and exploitation of marginalized communities. This could be better understood with the help of a case study which is given in your chapter. This case study is a real-life account of a Dalit family. This Dalit family used to live in Jakmalgur village. The villagers of Jakmalgur are gearing up for a big festival. Once in 5 years, the local deity is honored and the priests from 20 neighboring villages come for this 5-day event. The ceremony begins with a member of the Dalit community washing the feet of all the priests and then bathing in the water used for this. In Jakmalgur, the person who performed this task belonged to Ratnam's family. His father and grandfather had both performed the same task before him. Though they were never allowed to enter the temple, this ritual was viewed as a great honor bestowed on them on this special occasion. Now it was Ratnam's turn. Ratnam was all of 20 years studying in engineering in nearby college. He refused to perform this ritual. He said that he had no faith in this practice and his family members were forced to perform this ritual because they were Dalits. Ratnam's refusal angered both the powerful caste in the village and some families from his own community. The powerful caste, they were shocked that such a young boy had the guts to refuse. They believed that it was Ratnam's education which allowed him to imagine that he could start comparing himself with them. Now those who were from Ratnam's own caste, they were very fearful of angering the powerful. Many worked on their fields as daily wage laborers. If the dominant caste decide not to call them, then what would they earn? How would they survive? They also declared that the wrath of the local deity would strike them if they refused to give in. Ratnam argued that gift that not a single Dalit had ever entered the temple. Now how could the deity be angry with them? The powerful caste decided to teach Ratnam a lesson. His community was ordered to ostracize him and his family, and everyone was told that no one should speak or do any work for them or with them. One night, some man entered their part of the village and set his hut on fire. He managed to escape with his mother. Ratnam then went to file a case in the police station under the Scheduled Caste and Scheduled Tribe Prevention of Atrocities Act 1989. Other Dalit families still did not come out in his own support, as they were scared that a similar fate might await them if they spoke out. The case was picked up by the local media that led to many journalists visiting the village. Ratnam was written about as a symbol of Dalit action. The ritual was called off, but his family was forced to move out as they continued to be ostracized by the powerful caste in the village. Now let us discuss about the Scheduled Caste and the Scheduled Tribe Prevention of Atrocities Act 1989. Ratnam sought the support of law, filing his complaint under the above act to protest against the domination and violence of the powerful caste in the village. This act was framed in 1989 in response to demands made by the Dalits and others that the government must take seriously the ill treatment and humiliation Dalits and tribal groups face in an everyday sense. While such treatment had persisted for a long time, it had acquired a violent character in the late 1970s and 1980s. During this period, in parts of southern India, a number of assertive Dalit groups came into being and asserted their rights. They refused to perform their so-called caste duties and insisted on being treated equally. Like Ratnam, they refused to follow practices located in the humiliation and exploitation of Dalits. This resulted in the more powerful caste unleashing violence against them. In order to indicate to the government that untouchability was still being practiced and in the most hideous manner, Dalit group demanded new laws that would list the various sorts of violence against Dalit and prescribe stringent punishment for those who indulge in them. Likewise, throughout the 70s and 80s, Adivasi people successfully organized themselves and demanded equal rights and for their land and resources to be returned to them. They too had to face the anger of powerful social groups and were subject to a great deal of violence. This is why this act contains a very long list of crimes, some of which are too horrible even to contemplate. The act does not only describe terrible crimes but also lets people know what dreadful deeds human beings are capable of. In this sense, laws such as these seek to both punish as well as influence the way we think and act. The Act distinguishes several levels of crimes. Firstly, it lists modes of humiliation that are both physically horrific and morally reprehensible. Secondly, it lists action that disposes Dalit and Adivasis of their resources or which force them into performing slave labor. At another level, the Act recognizes that crime against Dalit and tribal women are of a specific kind and therefore seeks to penalize anyone who assaults or uses force on any woman belonging to a scheduled caste or a scheduled tribe with intent to dishonor her. Adivasi demands and the 1989 Act. The 1989 Act is important for another reason. Adivasi activists refer to it to defend their rights to occupy land that was traditionally theirs. As you read in the previous chapter, Adivasis are often unwilling to move from their land and are forcibly displaced. Activists have asked that those who have forcibly encroached upon tribal lands should be punished under this law. They have also pointed to the fact that this act merely confirms what has already been promised to tribal people in the constitution, that land belonging to tribal people cannot be sold or bought by non-tribal people. In cases where this has happened, the constitution guarantees the right of tribal people to repossess their land. C.K. Janu, an Adivasi activist, has also pointed out that one of the violators of constitutional right guaranteed to tribal people are governments in the various states of India, for it is they who allow non-tribal encroachers in the form of timber merchants, paper mills, etc. to exploit tribal land and to forcibly evict tribal people from their traditional forest in the process of declaring forest as reserved or as sanctuaries. So children, as we can see, the existence of a right or a law or even a policy on paper does not mean that it exists in reality. People have had to constantly work on or make efforts to translate these into principles that guide the action of their fellow citizens or even their leaders. With this thought in our mind, we conclude with the chapter. Goodbye.